That's good.
The Right War is published by Cambridge University Press. For more information, visit cambridge.org.
Filmmaker John Friedman is the editor of The Secret Histories, a collection of stories about times when corporate America and federal agencies misled the general public. Among the contributors are Edward R. Murrow and Bob Woodward. This talk is just over an hour and a half.
Official secrets, official histories. We're going to get a look at some of the people who have gotten behind the scenes on these this evening. The book is entitled The Secret Histories, and it's an anthology of documents that have revealed what's really gone on. Our speakers this evening are Morley Safer, who probably needs less introduction than almost anybody. He's been a correspondent on 60 Minutes since 1970. He's received a Lifetime Achievement Emmy, a Polk Award, and practically everything in broadcast journalism that is worth having. He has been commemorated with. Mark Danner, who is a longtime staff writer for The New Yorker and frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. He's a professor of journalism at Berkeley, and also Henry R. Luce Professor at Bard College. And his most recent book is Torture and Truth, America, Abu Ghraib, and the War on Terror. Philip Gurevich is the editor of the Paris Review. Until recently, he was a staff writer at The New Yorker. And he is the author of We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, which is the most incredible account of the massacres in Rwanda. The editor of the book, who will introduce the evening's discussion, is John S. Friedman, a journalist and filmmaker, and the compiler of The Secret Histories. So, Mr. Friedman.
David, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd particularly like to thank James Meter of Picador for setting this up, and Peter Rothberg of The Nation magazine. The first question I think that is on all our minds, before I get in the first question, I just want to add something that Mark Danner does have a new book coming out called The Secret Way to War, and both Philip and Mark and Morley have won numerous awards that are just too many to go into here. National Magazine Awards and numerous other awards. The first question that's on all our minds tonight, I think, has to do with the Fitzgerald investigation and the Judy Miller affair. And I'd like to ask each panelist what the Judy Miller imbroglio teaches us as journalists. Are there any times, for example, when reporters are justified in keeping secrets from their editors? Are there any times when reporters are justified in giving information to the courts? I think we see almost a tectonic change occurring now in our country in terms of the relationship between the press and the government. And I'd like each panelist to give his views on the subject, please. Morley?
On the question of keeping secrets from your editor, I think when you go in there with your pen and your pad, your editor is sitting on your shoulder. I mean, you and he or she are one. And I don't know an editor worth his salt who would let a reporter publish anything without knowing all the sources himself. Perhaps not having access to the sources, but at least being aware of the sources are. And the issue of the courts is another one. That's you say keeping secrets from the authorities when you say courts.
Exactly.
Well, that's what this part of this fight is all about reporters having shield laws, so that the courts really would be, at the very least, hampered in getting at the reporters.
Could you get close to
I'm sorry. I would hate to say a blanket no. We should never reveal secrets to authorities, to courts, because each of us could come up with a pretty interesting scenario of why one might want to hand over secrets to the authorities.
Mark?
Well, these are obviously very big issues. I agree with what Morley said about the relationship between the reporter and the editor or the producer in television. It seems to me that when you're in the position of being a correspondent or a reporter, your editor is on the same team as you are, and generally I think when you're working on very sensitive stories, there usually is an editor in position to know what you're doing, and in most cases to know to some degree about sources. And I would think in a case like this, normally there would be someone at the newspaper who would be informed about what exactly the situation was, the specific situation was, with relation to the reporter and her sources and what she heard from her sources. And I gather that the editor of the Times has expressed, in effect, public regret that he didn't inform himself more fully when the case arose about what exactly had happened with this specific reporter and her sources. So I don't think that is a hard problem. I think if you are not in a position to let your editor know what you're doing in a fairly specific way, something is wrong with the relationship between you and your editor or you and your producer. The question about the courts, as Morley said, is much more complicated. I'd certainly like to sit here and say I think reporters should not be compelled to reveal their sources. I think in general, if they can be compelled to reveal their sources, it does exert a chilling effect on what we're able to find out, that is, what journalists are able to find out about what the government is doing. It is one of the main ways that people in government who have problems with a policy or actually see wrongdoing being done, it is one way for them to do something about that wrongdoing, to talk to a reporter, to leak to the press. Governments, not surprisingly, particularly the politicians who lead them, hate this option. They hate it. But I think as far as the public goes, it's very much to the good. And as soon as you start throwing reporters in front of courts and compelling them to reveal sources, you're going to dry up the kind of information the public can get about what the government is doing. Having said that, there are probably a few exceptions. One would be if a crime is committed, and that is somewhat related to the case we're talking about. Should a reporter be able to have privilege if, in fact, she or he is covering up the commission of a crime or knows about the commission of the crime? I think those cases become much more complicated. I agree that there should be a federal shield law of some kind. Most state shield laws have exceptions for the commission of a crime, and it's a matter of debate whether they would have protected Judith Miller in this case. But it's complicated, obviously, very.
Bill?
Yeah, I think there's no real discussion on the editor question. I mean, if you don't reveal your sources to your editor, or if you resist revealing your sources to your editor, you shouldn't be trusted by your editor. Pretty simple. And if you don't trust your editor in reverse, if the case is in the reverse that you don't trust your editor, you shouldn't be working for him. So that's a pretty clean-cut thing, and that the profession wouldn't work otherwise, and that's simple enough. With courts, it is more complicated. It's not. I think Mark described it quite accurately in saying that the question of where a crime is committed is obviously very important. In the specific case of Judith Miller in the New York Times, what's troubling is that the Times sort of went to bat on the notion that there was a principle at stake, the principle of shielding one's sources, and that a newspaper should never be, or newspaper or its reporter should never be compelled to reveal a source. It seems to me that if you claim, and then the claim was retroactively that sort of, well, because we were debating principle and standing on principle, the details of the case were essentially not really worthy of attention, or at least that was the judgment at the time. That seems to me to be where the flaw in judgment took place. How do you know the principle applies if you don't actually take the time to investigate, which is what reporters and editors are supposed to do, and find out if this is a good instance? What if all the different kinds of things that people have speculated about as scenarios, and I don't want to suggest that any of them are true, but what if there's a crime being covered up What if the reporter was a party to that? What if the reporter has well, we were told that the reporter was standing on principle, but when she gave her own account of why she decided in the end to, after 85 days in jail, to speak, she said, I owed it to myself. And that didn't seem to be the principle that I recall her having championed or her editors having championed. So I think it's revolting that should suddenly turn out to be the principle in this case. And very troubling. And it of course, compromises and troubles a profession that, for whatever reason, seems to be a little bit lower than exterminators in the public opinion. And that's a problem, too, that, at this point, one does represent a profession at a high level, and it matters to all of us. That's why I think people get tetchy about this, and why the press covers itself sometimes to a degree that must seem nauseating to the rest of you. And as far as being compelled to testify, even without being compelled, I thought about this a certain amount in Rwanda. Imagine that you had what amounted to evidence that might be, or what might be considered evidence of interest to a war crimes tribunal that you as a reporter had uncovered. And you weren't even being compelled, you were just being asked. There were a lot of reporters, and I think this came up with Jonathan Randall and the tribunal on Yugoslavia, who would say, I refuse to have anything to do with any truck to do with a court. And my feeling has always been a bit more ambivalent about that there is a place where, one's privileged position as a journalist needn't interfere with one's position as a human being, and that there are times where you should say, well, I don't know. I wouldn't want to take it on a case-by-case basis. I've always felt that I wouldn't hide from a court what I would tell others. So if I'm being asked to repeat under oath what I've written in an article, and maybe not to go beyond that, I don't see where the harm in that goes. I stand by those facts. If I'm being asked to turn over a transcript of an interview that I've essentially reported every fact that I think is of interest in and that I wouldn't keep a secret and that I would anthologize, why would I withhold that from a court specifically on what's the principle? I haven't ever, luckily, been put in this position, and on the few times when I've been asked vaguely about such things in the abstract, I've always taken the sort of Bartleby the Scrivener kind of I would prefer not to. But it's a preference, it's not a principle there. And I think it gets complicated in those moments where the very truths that you seek to expose as a reporter are being asked for what could be argued to be the good for the civic good, let's just say, and it's awkward.
What strikes me, what strikes me about the Miller case, and something you asked at the very beginning about what do we learn from all this? What Judy Miller sought was a shield law from her editor. She wanted protection because she, according to the New York Times, she wouldn't level with them, and still has not. And for a reporter to tell her editor that she, and the courts, by the way, that she doesn't remember where she got Valerie Plane's name from is absurd.
Especially since she went to jail for 85 days to protect that person.
And the other question about, what can we learn from this, or what can young journalists learn from this, is that your biggest enemy is zealotry. And I think that's a lesson to be learned from the Judy Miller case.
Let me add one thing if I can, John. I think a point we should make here is that the privilege of the press can be used as a weapon, which very much overlaps with this case. I mean, this case is really about the government using leaks to smear somebody who was criticizing them. And I think one of the most troubling parts about, or aspects of this case, is that, in effect, the reporter involved and the leaker, whose identity we don't know whether he'll be indicted, made use of the privileged position of the reporter in society, in our society, to cover up, in effect, wrongdoing. That is, they were able to smear somebody, in effect, and use privilege to cover that up, to cover up their identity. To me, one of the most troubling parts of this case is the idea that the reporter would have identified Louis I. Libby, who is the chief of staff of the Vice President of the United States and one of the most powerful people in the American government, that she agreed to identify him as a former Hill staffer. She didn't, in effect, identify him as such because she didn't do the piece, but the notion of doing that sends chills down my spine because, in effect, it's a collaboration with the powerful to smear somebody and to help them cover up their tracks, not only not to name the smearer, but in effect disguise, actively to disguise the identity. And I think that is a bit of a warning to everybody that privilege, on the one hand, allows the free flow or freer flow of information, which I think is absolutely vital, as I said before, but it also can be misused, and misused in a particularly, in this case, a particularly troubling way by the government if journalists are willing to collude, in effect, with the government in doing dirty tricks, which is what, in effect, we have here.
The Bush administration, I'm sorry.
I would add one other thing, which is a little more mundane, perhaps, and sort of takes us down from a notch from the sort of notion of journalistic ethics, such as they may be, which is that journalism is essentially an intensely, a ferociously competitive profession. It's sort of combat sport of a certain kind. That competitiveness ideally occurs between news organizations, each seeking to beat the other one to the story, and in some sense that competitiveness between news organizations can serve the general common purpose of trying to, get the best version of the story to the public, because you don't want them to get it to the public first, so you do, and so you're both ultimately on the same side there. On the other hand, it often gets inside organizations as well, as I think we're seeing. And people will compete. Obviously, you've got 5 people in a bureau. They're not all saying, "Oh no, please, you go first." And so there's a lot of competitiveness there. And I think the drive for scoops, which motivates editors to push journalists, can also is probably in this case some of what can make a journalist not necessarily always so eager to check everything and be as investigative as they might want to be. They've got a big story. It's going to be a front page story. They've got it double sourced to government. Judy Miller, in her bizarre article in the New York Times a couple Sundays ago, stated, or in the article about her, said, on the WMD thing we were all wrong. Nice of her to say it now. On the WMD thing, we were totally wrong. We all got that wrong. Our sources were wrong, and you're only as good as your sources. And to me, that was as troubling as the sort of question of disguising a source, because, well, yeah, you're only as good as your sources, especially when you only have 2 sources and they both are involved in the same small group of people who are planning a war and trying to spin it. And so there's a real question there when somebody is sort of prepared to carry water for sources to get scoops. Because there's no question that she's an ambitious journalist, and that eagerness to get those big stories is driving a lot of that. And I think it's sort of just to understand the mechanism of it. You don't have to get conspiratorial about it. You can sometimes just look at the sheer rampant competitive ambition.
Secrecy has become an overriding weapon of the government. The Bush presidency is the most secretive in our history. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, has pointed out that power, particularly abuses of power, rely on secrecy. Today, $7 billion is being spent by our government to keep the secrets. 4,000 employees make classification decisions, in addition to another 3 million contractors, independent contractors, who can classify material. The Bush administration has created a culture of secrecy. As a matter of fact, a few years ago even, before the Bush administration, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said that secrecy in government has become a hidden, humongous, metastasizing mass. He pointed out that if every newspaper in the country devoted every page to printing classified documents produced on that day alone, there would be no room for anything else.
Total deforestation.
My question to the panel is, has the government, by using secrecy, usurped us, that is the press, and why has the press let the government get away with this? What is going on?
Well, first of all, the Bush administration didn't invent secrecy. And it may be a very secret administration, but I think on balance, probably no more secret than most. They keep their secrets better than most, or they seem to have kept their secrets better than most. And it's something we were talking about earlier. I think one of the great strengths of this country is the fragility of the secret. That you're always going to find somebody who may not reveal the secret to you, but he'll point you in the right direction to revealing the secret. And one of the great strengths of this country is that we don't disappear leakers. I mean, the people who give you the secrets or hint towards the secrets. And in my experience, the Johnson administration was just as paranoid about secrecy as this administration, and I'm sure the others will find will find examples of this excessive paranoia, if you like. I think Foucault likes to go a little over the top, as lots of people do. But yes, it is a terribly secretive government, and a lot of the secrets they keep, as all intelligence organizations, are utterly absurd. And some of them are so absurd that they're so absurd, it's the precise reason why they're so classified. And I'm sure they will have even more examples than I. So while this is a very secret administration, it is not any more secret than others have been.
I certainly agree that the major difference, it seems to me, between this administration and the ones that came before, while it may classify more documents, that may well be true, I think it is true, by an order of magnitude, for example, perhaps. The biggest difference, though, as Morley Safer implies, is their discipline in keeping their people from talking, which means punishing leakers. It means finding out the people who leak within the government, within the bureaucracy, and punishing them, making sure that they don't do it again, and doing it in such a way that others within the bureaucracy, others within the government, see that, and they clam up as well. They're also very disciplined. You asked why the press is letting them get away with it. And I might take issue with that characterization, but I think one of the important points to make is not only are they disciplined about how they treat their own employees, how they treat government officials who leak, but they're very disciplined in how they treat the people who cover them. That is, if you write a story that they don't like, you will be frozen out. And this administration has been extraordinarily disciplined in having a clear idea of who they want to speak to, what press organs are important to them, and what ones essentially aren't. They've tended to ignore the New York Times, for example. The administration granted the Times very few interviews, froze out its reporters for a number of years at the beginning of the administration. They've been very disciplined about realizing that their supporters are not necessarily the ones who read the New York Times. I think that the difference with this administration, while it may classify a lot more material, is its relentless urge and its general success until very recently in controlling its people and in disciplining the press, who, as Phil pointed out, are in a very competitive world, who need stories to advance. You know, if you're covering the White House, and the White House is not cooperating with you, they're not talking to you, they're not giving you the right interviews, they're not making people available to you, you're in trouble. You're not going to be doing very well at your newspaper or at your television station. You need cooperation. And I think this White House has been singularly effective in realizing their own power and deploying their own power in disciplining, in effect, members of the press. Now, having said that, I want to take issue a little bit about the assumption, as Morley did, but even go farther, about the assumption that secrecy is the key item here. I tend to think that most of the stories that are most important are the ones that are right in front of us, but that aren't noticed. That is, very often to me, it's what's already been revealed but because of political reasons is not emphasized enough, that is the real story here. It's not a question of keeping things secret. Let me give you an example. The torture story, Abu Ghraib. That was made public by CBS News 60 Minutes in April 2004, a year and a half ago. A couple days later, The New Yorker published the photographs as well with a piece by Seymour Hersh. Now that story, to date, has resulted in the punishment or the imprisonment, the trials of 7 enlisted people, essentially. None of the officials who were responsible for that behavior, and we know who they are, we have the documents, a lot of this stuff has been leaked. The torture memo of August 2002, which redefined torture as, for something to be torture, it has to be causing pain equivalent to major organ failure or death. That is, they redefine torture in such a way that you can do an awful lot to a person without it being illegal, without it being torture. The people who were responsible for this, none of them have been punished. In fact, several of the major players, like Alberto Gonzales, who was then White House counsel, has been promoted. He's now the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement official of the United States. Now, why is that? Well, a lot has been written about the torture story. But the political atmosphere was not adequate to cause the kind of investigations in Congress, and it's a Republican Congress, obviously, or the kind of independent investigation, which would have caused a real change and would have caused people to be actually punished. So we have there a story that's sitting right in front of us. I call these frozen scandals. They're scandals where you've had the revelation. We know a lot of the information. But the next step, you usually go, if you look at Watergate, for example, you go from revelation to investigation, which is not just the press's job, it's very often the courts and the legislature, in that case the Watergate Committee, and then expiation, which is to say punishment, where people are punished, they're fired, they're put in jail, and so on, and you return to a state of grace before the particular crime or particular violation was committed. And we're sitting in a situation today where we have a lot of scandals, I think, that are in effect public, that have been revealed already. It's not secrecy that's keeping them from being punished. It's politics. I learned this in the very first long investigation I did about the massacre at El Mozote. People knew what happened, it had been revealed, but politics prevented its being pursued to a legal and just end. And I think as we sit here today, that is the situation we find ourselves in. We're surrounded by frozen scandals about the war, about torture, about many other issues that we know about, that the press has revealed to some extent, but that have not followed a train toward punishment.
Philip, in your remarks to this question, would you also talk about the United Nations, as you said earlier? Please.
Sure, I'm happy to. I would start by saying that I'm in agreement to a large degree with the notion that secrecy is not simply the problem. If the idea is that power is accrued by the abuse of secrecy, the complaint is with power. It's the abuse of power. Because you really can't have power without some secrecy. You can't really have much without secrecy. I mean, most novelists have at some point or another come up with some version of the phrase that, you know, what's a character except a bundle of secrets? And, you know, whether it's Bob Stone or Andre Malraux, these are totally central concepts to their understanding of kind of particularly political man. And I think that states, you cannot effectively exercise power without secrets. As anybody who's been a parent, as anybody who's been in charge of, ever had an employee, as anybody who's in any way tried to run anything knows, certainly newspapers understand this perfectly because, you know, if we suddenly had employees who were running around leaking to other newspapers, we'd go nuts and fire them immediately and want them strung up just as much as George Bush wants them strung up. So I think that the question is really the real problem right now, if there is something specific about this moment, because I do agree that past administrations would have been just as secretive, and if anything, if there's any difference, it's only that they're jealous of the effectiveness of this administration, and that is that we are now living in a one-party state in terms of the exercise of power, and that's not the fault of the party in power. You cannot blame the Republicans for controlling the entire administration both houses of Congress, and increasingly it looks like the Supreme Court. It is the fault, it is the absence of an opposition. And the press needs that as much as anybody, because where do stories come from? Where do leaks come from? It's not a leak if an opposition politician says, let me give you the documents, and I'll take credit for it. I'm not leaking it. I want attribution. The way the press works, and this is not in praise of the press, by the way, but the way that the Washington press works to some extent is it needs a story of opposition. It needs to say there are two sides to the story. It can't say there are two sides to the story. There is what the administration says, and there is the truth. For some reason, that seems to be a problem the American press has had a lot of trouble with. What they can say is there are two sides to the story. Here's what the administration says, and here's what the head of the opposition says, right? And if the head of the opposition also happens to run a committee in Congress, or because they happen to have control of a House of Congress, then they're in a position to actually call hearings, make trouble and make difficulty and put pressure and create some sort of a balance. And then you have an oppositional story where there are two sides and the press can pretend this great press fiction of neutrality, which is that we're not really interested in the truth, we're interested in the truth of the two positions. We're interested in describing conflicts. And in a situation where you have an extremely effective party at controlling the press that also happens to be unopposed, you have a very odd situation. And you have a unique situation, really, at least in recent time, for the press, which can't count on being, in some sense, browbeat into doing stories by opposition leaders in Congress. And it's not that there isn't a second party. There is, nominally there. They exist, Democrats. You can find them on the ballot. But you don't actually find them in politics. I mean, George Bush I covered last year's election, and what really struck me about it is that for a wartime president, he did very, very poorly for somebody running unopposed. And on all of the important issues that are now being debated, he was unopposed. There was no discussion of torture. If you asked the Kerry campaign, which I did repeatedly, why he never mentioned torture, they had no answer. They just didn't do it. They never really raised the question of the war in a meaningful way. The whole thing was diverted by a bunch of strange false debates which they seemed incapable of being able to respond to. And the press can be criticized, but only for its kind of internal structure, which is, so the Swift boat story, let's say, comes along, and you could say, well, forget about the Swift boat story, just call it bunk and move on to torture. But they can't, because they're not getting somebody to tell them the story. They can't go to John Kerry and say, look, we'd like to do a story on torture and divert the attention from the Swift boat attack. We'd like to turn it around and say, this is an important issue before the nation. Can you say something about torture? If he doesn't say something about torture, they're stuck.
Well, you see, at the beginning of this
They
question,
needn't be, but they get stuck.
You made the point, well, where was the press? And I agree with you. I think the press, first of all, we do allow these people to set our agenda, and I think that's a terrible mistake.
I agree.
And we're not structured that way. We're self-structured. We follow stories. We don't break stories.
Right.
Most of the stories we do, we're following something. We're not breaking the story. But as of September 11th, 2001, there's no question we went into hiding. And it was yes or boss to everything the president said. We did not question a single thing. And look, and by the way, neither did the non-existent opposition.
Right. If they had, the press would have covered it, is all I'm trying to say there. They would have said, oh, look.
But as we had the build-up to war, and as Colin Powell was going in front of the UN with what clearly patent crap that they were trying to shove it down the throat of the world, we were in the sidelines or even applauding. And we read the pitiful mea culpa in the New York Times some time after. I think we did let the country down. We did let the country down, to some extent understandable, after the dreadful shock of September 11th, which hit us as much as it hit anyone else. And we were afraid to raise our heads above the trenches. And it's been almost 5 years, and it took a hurricane for us to raise our heads above the trenches in terms of just routinely critical looks at the administration. I'm not talking about hounding anybody, just the standard questioning that we as reporters do all the time to the party in power, to the people in power. Now, the people also in power in the Senate, the Democrats, as Philip said, were even bigger cowards than we were. I was rereading on the way over the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, for example, another con job of dragging us into war, and the entire Senate and House voted for that resolution, except for 2 senators, Gruning and Morris, and that was it. But at least as the scales fell from their eyes, fairly soon after, Fulbright and others got on the anti-war bandwagon. Took too many years to come into any kind of effect. We haven't had. How long's this war been going on now? Is it 4 years? 3 years.
Yeah.
There's not been one dissenting voice, not a single dissenting voice in the Congress. And sad to say, because he's a man I like a lot and a friend of sorts, John Kerry became a coward in his campaign.
Well,
and, one of the most unlikely cowards I can think of.
I don't know. I guess I would take issue with that a little. God, I can't believe I'm defending John Kerry here in public. I think coward is perhaps a bit harsh there. I think the Democrats, since 9/11, have found themselves in a very difficult position, which is they're a party that the country traditionally, at least in the last 20 years or so, doesn't trust very much on national security, at least compared to the Republicans. Karl Rove, in a very well-publicized speech in, I think it was January 2002, said this publicly in Texas, that all we have to do here is run on national security and we will win because Americans trust us more on national security. And in fact, that is what they did in the fall of 2002, and they did. They took the Senate, which was narrowly in Democratic hands, they took back, and they scored victories in both houses. So politically, they've been very successful in using national security. And Kerry's very existence as a candidate was really owed to the fact that the Democratic Party thought that this man his flank would be secure against attacks on being weak on foreign affairs and weak on national security. And as Phil pointed out, that election was extremely close. In fact, I think in a century it was the closest re-election of any incumbent president, but for 80,000 votes in Ohio, we might be here saying that cowardly strategy that Kerry adopted was in fact successful. He had a problem, which is that his party was very dramatically divided between people who were disgusted by the war and thought the U.S. should get out, and people who opposed that position. Things have changed significantly since then in this country. And you're seeing, I think, the press get, I think it wasn't just the hurricane that led the press to put its heads over the trenches, in Morley Safer's pungent metaphor. I think it has to do with the approval ratings of the president and the Republican Party. Their power has slipped away significantly in the last 6 months, largely owing to dissatisfaction with the war. The public has turned against it. Fewer than a third of the public support it still in the latest CBS News poll. And you see, as that's happening, as the power of the one-party state, of the one party state slips away, the binds that have been around people and the gags that have been over their mouths are starting to slip. You're starting to get more leaks in Washington. The press is starting to step out more aggressively, and the opposition, which, as Phil pointed out, is absolutely critical to having a real debate in this country, is finally starting a little bit to step forward, a little bit. So I guess I'm a little reluctant to see John Kerry or the Democrats called simply cowardly. I think they recognized a political reality, which is that they were very weak on national security, and it's hard to believe now, when you look back on it, that most of the leading Democrats voted for this war, which is still poisoning the debate in this country about what to do about Iraq. The fact that most of the leading members of what should be the opposition are implicated in having supported it to begin with. I also want to say that a lot of this information that's now coming out about WMD and all the rest of it, again, a lot of it was public before. You know, Mohammed al-Baradei issued a report before the war saying this stuff about his nuclear program, Saddam's supposed nuclear program, was nonsense. Now, it was reported in the New York Times. It was not reported on the front page of the New York Times. The New York Times ran on the front page Judy Miller's pieces about aluminum tubes and all the other things that suggested that if Saddam was not attacked and removed, then the smoking gun would become a mushroom cloud. So a lot of these were decisions by editors what to lay stress on.
I guess
Yeah.
I want to suggest something that doesn't have much to do with secrecy, but does have to do with this question of, when you say it took the hurricane to get them above the trenches, but it was September 11th that put the press to sort of duck its head. Something that struck me in trying to think about what's become of the press is I was very struck, certainly most of the stories that I've covered in my reporting have been foreign stories, and usually I've been drawn to stories that are, certainly at least in terms of political news stories, and I've been drawn to stories where the press really just isn't, or they're very thin on the ground, and overlooked stories and aftermath stories and so forth. So for me, covering the election was also kind of a fascinating education in how press packs and so forth work, and how the big American press machine works. And one of the things that really struck me is, far from people used to say to me, gee, being a foreign correspondent, is that really as glamorous as in the movies? And, and I said, yeah, actually, I do believe that on one level there's something about this profession that stayed sort of true to its swashbuckling image from the past, unlike a lot of professions, which is that, it is you out there scratching and scraping along and trying to find your way. I would say that domestically that's the opposite is true, that I found what really struck me is that there was the class from which reporters come, and the class from which power comes, and the class in which they reside as they're at the peaks of their profession is very much the same. That reporters and the people they cover live cheek by jowl in the same neighborhoods. They're no longer the guys from across the track who are wisecracking in the newsroom and saying, we'll keep the bastards honest, and sort of we'll bring them down. The sort of old Boston Globe tough Irish guys who looked at a guy like Kerry and said, oh, patrician, oh, isn't that nice? And they kind of went after him, right? And they went after the guy in Washington. They tried to keep them humble and keep them honest a little bit. Now they're in the same Bethesda school system. They're going to the same Ivy League schools. They're coming out of the same clubs. They socialize together. They worry about access as a matter of social connection. The question that arose earlier about access and about sort of what Mark was describing as the guy who's sitting in the White House and who's not getting access and who starts to feel like he's slipping within his organization. Hell, access is worthless when everybody lies to you. I just don't find access to be very exciting when you're talking to liars. And so it seems to me that what you ought to do is go across the street and get a good story on the White House from somebody else. And then you come back and you say, guess what's happening at the White House? Something they're not talking about. But you don't get that when people are a little too polite. And it's sort of funny that it is a class story that kind of woke up the press. My gosh, there's something actually happening in our country that the hurricane revealed that we haven't really been seeing and that we aren't really paying attention to. And why haven't we? Because we're not coming from there. We're not hearing about it. We don't live there. We live in the same strange bubble as the politicians that we cover. And I think that's a real danger, sort of sociologically, to kind of keeping the engines running well.
And also there's too much press, and that's clearly a problem.
Yeah, that's true.
So that, so that if somebody is under a politician, under some pressure to come clean, he can cherry pick where he's going to quote unquote come clean. Generally on the Fox networks, but also on some of the NBC networks as well. And so there's too much. There are too many bolt holes for these guys where they can claim they've come clean, but in fact haven't. And I think Philip's point about is particularly true in Washington.
Yeah.
It's almost a caricature of a relationship.
I'd like to pick up something that I think is beneath the surface here that I have to point out, and that is corporate control of the media. That I think 60 Minutes, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and a few other places are unique in our society in that most corporate-owned news outlets, I think, have a certain establishment view towards stories.
I wish we were unique. I'm afraid we're part of them.
The Paris Review, in fact, accepts charitable donations.
Morley, I'm going to put you on the spot here for a moment
Okay.
and ask, all over the internet, there have been stories saying, why doesn't 60 Minutes now put out its story on the Niger documents, on the Niger uranium documents that was supposed to run before the election last year and was canceled? What is going on there?
That's a story more complicated than you've just described, or the internet describes. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know the whole story. It was something that was started before the awful memo story on 60 Minutes 2 or 60 Minutes Wednesday, as it was called. That I think originally was meant to have gone onto that broadcast, or onto a special hour of that broadcast. Well, that broadcast was by then mortally wounded, as you know. And where it stands, I honestly don't know. I mean, I can also fairly say that at this point, there's very little that is not known about the Niger story, and even back then, there was very little that was not known about Niger. We knew there were some forged documents. We knew what the British had claimed, or what the Italians had claimed. That was all pretty well known, and much of it had been reported. So if you're looking for find a better story for us to suppress than that one. That's hardly
have there been any other stories are there any other examples you'd like to talk about?
No, I honestly can't think of any. And I must say that in the whatever it is, 42 or 3 years that I worked for CBS, we pretty much have in my experience, the front office has stayed out of the newsroom, and that was a policy set by Bill Paley. It's slipped, no doubt, since we no longer have a Bill Paley, and we are now part of corporate journalism, a major corporation that we joined and been split from, joined and then are being split from again, and I hope we stay split or as split as possible. But I can't, there's never been a situation that I've had to confront where the front office has killed the story that I've been working on, and most of the people I know have been working, or most of the people I know.
Mark, I want to pick up a point just that you mentioned earlier, and that is it's not so much secrecy, you said, as information that is revealed but not picked up. And I can list a number of stories today that we know something about. In other words, as Mark Twain said, we know very often in history we see the tip of the submerged frog, but we don't see the lower half. And it's up to people such as Mark and Morley and Philip to investigate the lower half. But what are some of these stories today that are out there that we know about that are not being covered? I'll list a few. Corruption in Iraq. Must be terrible corruption going on with the contractors and the government, with money being carried in suitcases. Is there any accounting? I don't know. Is the press covering this? Not really. What about the use of death squads in Iraq? We've seen some reports on this. No one has really followed up. Who is running these death squads? Who are they targeting? What about the aftermath of Katrina? Who is getting the money? Where is the money going? Again, the question of corruption. The anthrax inquiry disappeared off the radar screen. Is the FBI not pursuing any leads? What about Darfur? What actually is going on there? Are people being killed on a daily basis? Is hunger still prevalent there? As Philip did when he went to Rwanda, he gave an insider's view. I don't know any insider today who is in Darfur who is giving an insider's view. Mark and Abu Ghraib. Mark broke some of the key documents on the Downing Street memo, using the Downing Street memo. What about the follow-up to Abu Ghraib today? What is going on? Is there still torture occurring? So I'm throwing out these thoughts to the rest of the panel to get your reaction.
Okay. That's a lot of thoughts. Let me say a word, first of all, about the piece that you mentioned, the 60 Minutes piece, because I happen to know a little bit about it, which is that in the aftermath of the difficulties over the Dan Rather story on George Bush's National Guard career, that story was pulled, and the public explanation of it was that it was inappropriate to run it before the election. And my sense of it, just things I've heard publicly, is that there are things in that story that would be very interesting to hear. I wouldn't by no means accuse CBS of suppressing it, but I hope at some point that they do decide that it's ready to run, because I would like very much to see it, particularly in its details about the Italian side of this and so on. We still don't know where those documents actually in the end came from. We have some notion about who forged them. We're talking about the documents, I should say, that supposedly suggested that Saddam Hussein was buying uranium or yellow cake in Niger. Those were clearly forged. They were clumsy forgeries, but who actually did the forging and how they were given such credence apparently by the American government when, in fact, the IAEA, Mohammed al-Baradei, was able to show they were forgery in a matter of hours. That story hasn't come to light as fully as it should. So I hope that story will eventually come out from CBS and from other places. All the stories you mentioned, there are a lot of them. I think we have to distinguish, though, between stories that are actually secrets, stories that are difficult to cover, and stories, finally, that the press is interested in one day and not interested in the next. I think corruption in Iraq is a terrific story. It's an enormous story. I have a feeling, back to this point about the symbiosis between the opposition party and the press, that if indeed the Democrats succeed in taking one of the houses of Congress in 2006, I think you will see hearings on this, and I think this will be a very large story, because I think billions of dollars have disappeared with no accountability in Iraq, literally billions of dollars. A lot of that money was Iraqi money. It was money that they had, oil money that the U.S. essentially took over and handed out in blocks of bills. One of the reasons, by the way, it's not being covered now is because it's extremely difficult to do it. Mobility in Iraq, I've just returned from Iraq a few days ago. It's extremely hard to get around, you're very constrained, you're under threat every moment. You need to travel with a lot of security people. Doing a story like that, an investigative story like that, is very difficult logistically. And the bureaus of the major news organizations, including the New York Times, CBS, and so on, have their hands full covering the news day to day. Because in order to cover the news day to day, to get anywhere in Iraq, you need to have a bunch of security people, you need armored cars, you need armed guards. Very difficult. Just the logistics of covering the place now are very hard. And this was emphasized a couple of days ago with the attack on the Palestine Hotel, where I was a day before that. And they actually, these apparently Zarqawi people came very close to knocking down this hotel, which would have killed hundreds of people, including the Fox News Bureau, AP, I believe, and a lot of news people are living there. So I think death squads is another story you mentioned that I'm going to be writing a little bit about after this trip. There are apparently squads of people who are arresting mostly Sunnis, who are directed apparently from the Ministry of Interior. You hear this all over. It's a very hard story, again, to nail down by its nature. Reporting about death squads is very hard. The victims, by definition, are not there to interview. Families are afraid. It's hard to, people make these claims. It's very hard to find somebody who can actually witness it and have corroboration. But I think that story will start to come out as well. But it's a very difficult story to handle. It's not necessarily because anyone is keeping it secret. It's just doing a story on death squads is hard by its nature. I think the Katrina aftermath is, again, a very good story, but my impression is some of that is being covered. The Downing Street memo and Abu Ghraib, well, I've written about both of those things, and I had both of those stories in mind a few minutes ago when I said that, the issue very often isn't secrets, it's what's revealed and what's done with it. Downing Street, when I first saw that memo on May 1st, last May, I read it and thought, the legal phrase, res ipso loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. I mean, here was a document that said very clearly that the decision for the war was made very early, that the United States went to the UN essentially to bring the British along because the British were worried about international agreement and having an international blessing. I mean, it's a fascinating document. And as the days went by after I first read it, I was astonished that the American press basically ignored it. Finally, the New York Review, at my urging, published the text. But in general, the American press, I think partly because they didn't quite know what to make of it. They didn't know what exactly does this prove. Actually, we've seen all this before. I think there was a degree of embarrassment about the job that the press had done and the stories it had missed in the run-up to the war. Because essentially that document, which is simply the account of a cabinet meeting in July 2002, a British cabinet meeting, essentially confirmed that the decision to go to war was made very early and that the UN was essentially used as a screen for the administration to go to war. I urge all of you to read it. It's 3 pages. It's a very short document. But we still have not had very much coverage of that. Why? I think the press is somewhat embarrassed about it, to state it in broad terms. In Abu Ghraib, this is a story that's been going on a year and a half. The administration now is publicly urging, in the person of the vice president, urging that the U.S. in essence make torture legal. That is happening. It's being covered in the press. John McCain put forward a bill that said the U.S. will not torture. This is illegal. It was passed 90-9 in the Senate. The administration is opposing that bill and fiercely opposing it, threatening to veto the defense appropriations bill if the language of that bill is not changed. The vice president met with McCain the other day and demanded a loophole that would allow essentially the CIA to torture, not to put too fine a point on it. There have been fierce editorials about this in the Washington Post and the New York Times, I believe today or yesterday. It's been covered in the press. One of the problems with this, though, I have to say, is television. The torture story, after the first pictures were revealed, has not been a very televisual story. There have not been images to record. And it's a fact of life in this country that television is the most important area of the news business. It's where most Americans get their news. And when you have a story that does not have pictures attached to it, and the Abu Ghraib/torture story has not, I think it's very difficult to cover it day to day. Having said that, 60 Minutes has done a number of stories. Television has not by any means ignored it, but it has been much more of a print story than a television story.
I would also add that it's a tough story because, it's a tricky thing. The press, for the most part, reporters are not either experts or necessarily even intellectuals, idea people. They're news-gathering machines, the people who are out there on the front line. Obviously, the machinery of it. The basic idea of exposing torture is you shame those involved. If it turns out that those involved actually want to legalize it and are unapologetic, what happens if you try to shame somebody who's not apologetic? It changes the story, and it throws the press into a weird position. Right? Because the press is saying, wait a minute, we caught you torturing people, and they're saying, that wasn't torture, that should be the law of the land.
Well,
and then that's a different story, because then you're saying, wait a minute, they want to legalize torture. And they're saying, but we're not trying to legalize torture. We're trying to make it not torture. Then it's legal. We think torture should be illegal. We just think these things aren't torture. Yeah. Right? And then they're very, very good at unscrewing the heads of reporters who think that they've got them in some sort of, the legal maneuvers here. And also making everything politicized. The idea is, oh, that's your opinion. I remember one of the assaults on the press. The New York Times is taking the hits here, but just before the election last year, well, there were 2 moments during the election last year where this kind of a thing came up, where the press kind of got thrown back on its heels a little bit, interestingly. One was, I don't remember if you may recall that Bush, during his speech at the Republican convention, kind of made a taunt at the editorials of the New York Times. I don't care what the New York Times says, or something like this. And a couple of editors at the New York Times felt that this sort of shout-out in the middle of his speech was really very intimidating. And I thought, why? Who cares? Shout back. And then the next thing was Cheney. Well, you may remember that shortly before the election, there was the discovery in Iraq of this giant arms depot that was sort of lying with its doors flapping in the breeze, and all these empty, do not swallow poison kind of Roadrunner cartoon kind of WMD canisters lying empty. And, one bed went on the horizon. It was like they went that away. And it was just shocking. And Cheney simply went on TV and said, come on, the only source for that story is the New York Times. Now this throws reporters back on their heels because they're saying, well, no, the source for the story is like the evidence that we've presented within the story. It's not the logo that says the New York Times. And this kind of a thing has been very complicated, but I think with the torture story, and it gets to the question of why stories end up, I think the original question, John, that you were asking, which is sort of all these stories that are not covered. The fact is I sort of take it as given that many important stories will not be covered. Some, as Mark says, sitting right in front of us, that just cease to develop. And some, there is a headline impulse. There is a decision that has to be made each day, what's important. And then there's a question of where there's a reporter. Where there's somebody who's figuring something out, where somebody has something. Why don't we know about Darfur? Because it's really hard to report in Darfur, and because it's really confusing in Darfur, and because the fact of the matter is nobody on earth wants to do anything about Darfur. And it's not clear what doing something about Darfur would entail. Right now we have a natural disaster, the Himalayan earthquake story in Pakistan, where it seems like a tremendous number of people are going to facing an incredibly hard winter and incredibly harsh circumstances, and somehow it's just not on people's, we're not bombarded with it the way we were with the tsunami or with Katrina. Why? There's always saturation.
Well, I think the torture story, by the way, the administration has succeeded, and it didn't have to work very hard, to convince an awful lot of this country that the only thing standing between us and another 9/11 is a torturer. Mm-hmm. That a torture is really effective in the war on terrorism. And we know, and all the scientific proof is out there that the kind of physical torture they're talking about is pretty much doesn't work. That the victim of torture generally will give the answer he thinks the torturer wants. And that's not very difficult to figure out. But I think the lack of resistance or outrage or whatever you want to call it, the quaint Geneva Conventions and all of that, is a product of the fear that's in this country, not just engendered by the administration. It was out there, and we were part of it. We, the press, or
and revenge.
Television.
It's a mixture of fear and revenge. I think the idea was, we're going to go over there, and we're going to take the gloves off over there.
Yeah, well, that's
and if we're not fighting them here, we're fighting them over there. And the idea, it's not accidental that seems to have been very much in the front and center. So this is for 9/11.
First rule of war is dehumanize the enemy. Then you can do anything.
And this does get back to the question that John raised a little earlier about the commercial press. When you have a country that is frightened, that is rallying around the president, that feels it's been attacked, it's terrified. The press is not in a position, or the press is worried about its own. Popularity isn't quite the word. I guess workability is the word. We have a press in this country that essentially depends on people tuning in, the broadcast press, and depends on people buying newspapers. I think television, again, is particularly vulnerable to this, that I think people don't want to be in the position to be labeled as Americans who are not supporting the administration in time of war. And I think it's worth reminding people of that atmosphere after 9/11, that it has to do with the fact also that television depends on ratings, newspapers depend on sales. Morley Safer's point about the fact that the administration was able to convince the American people that the only thing standing between them and the terrorists was a torture, I think is a very good one. But I think I'd add something to it, which is that the administration also very intelligently put out an alternative story. And the alternative story was Animal House on the night shift, in the words of the former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, who was one of the investigators of Abu Ghraib. That is, there were these rogue people late at night doing these things. These did not happen under orders. No one knew about it, etc. Now that argument has been thoroughly disproved. If you look at the actual information about what happened, when it happened, and so on, but the great number of the American people don't look at that information. And the president has been able to go out there, and the leading officials in the government have been able to go out there, and regardless of what's been found, have been able to repeat this argument. And the great majority of the American people, partly because torture is a very antipathetic, an awful subject. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to think about Americans doing it. They're willing to accept this story. And again, I think the administration has been very disciplined in thinking that, we don't care about the people necessarily.
Excuse me.
Reading the Times.
Have some time for questions,
Sure.
too.
Mm-hmm.
So, we could go on, and a lot of these subjects are raised in my book, The Secret Histories, which will be available after the discussion. I'll be glad to sign any copies for anybody who wants me to. I'd like to take questions from the audience now on any subject that you like, but please use one of the microphones on either side. Yes.
I wanted to address the matter of the importance of sources or leakers in investigative reporting. What it brought to my mind is the work of I.F. Stone, who relied entirely on public sources of information like the congressional record and the federal budget, and had no access or didn't want any to government officials.
Anybody want to address that? Work of I.F. Stone. Let me just say that I.F. Stone is one of my great heroes, and I think that he led the way in a certain type of investigative reporting in America, that no one wanted to print what he published, so he had to start his own newsletter.
It's called blogging. I mean, it is blogging what he did, and there are a lot of bloggers that do this sort of thing. They just throw up documents online and mark them up for you. But also, I would say that, just as Mark said that many of the stories that matter are in plain sight, just being overlooked, I would say that most of the so-called exposés that I've ever had really are the part that come from interviews. That when you go and you talk to people, it may not be the decision maker, but you talk to people around the edges and after the fact, and they say extraordinarily revealing things. Often they think they're telling their story very effectively to their own benefit, and they nevertheless are saying things that do not necessarily reflect well on them. But I think that the idea that everything requires the puncture or penetration of a secret and makes it all sound terribly difficult and clandestine to be an investigative journalist is not true. Digging takes all different forms, and quite often it's not classified, it's not illegal, there's no treachery involved, there's just simply getting people to gab.
I agree with that. I'm a great admirer of I.F. Stone's, and he started a wonderful tradition. I'd include Ted Draper in that, Walter Karp, people who basically sat down with a newspaper and publicly available documents and read them intelligently, documents that very often other people don't look at. I'd add to what Phil just said that I've always flinch a little when I hear the phrase investigative reporter, because it's always seemed to me redundant that being a reporter is supposedly to investigate and find things out. And I agree, to get someone talking is very often the best source of information, because as cops know very well, and reporters do too, people want to tell their story. They want to be listened to, they want to talk, and they're very often unaware of the newsworthiness of what they're saying.
And most people are taken in by their own self-deceptions. I mean, the way that they deceive you is the way they deceive themselves, or try to deceive you.
In Vietnam, so many important stories that came to us, and me personally, from soldiers, both enlisted men and fairly senior officers, who felt they had no one else to go to. There's certainly the last place they wanted to go to was the chain of command, because they generally had been there already in some form or other. And it's, I mean, some of it you obviously can't take what they say, you have to then go and see for yourself. But the initial contact, if you like, did not come as a result of any sleuthing or digging or anything else. It was walking over the transom or walking through the door. And generally speaking, I've found that the people who do it do not, in that situation, do not do it for aggrandizement. You wouldn't even know their names anyway. I mean, they would not become familiar names the way anyone would today. The young soldier from Iraq, for example, who suddenly is on 17 cable channels. You know, this is just a guy coming into the office and saying, "You want to go for a beer?" And that's the beginning and end of his involvement. That doesn't happen anymore. I think there's been a change in culture as well. I think they're all going to write a book about something.
I want to throw out a question to all of you, and that is that the press takes its cue from the public. And yet the American public in the last couple of years has really been asleep in many ways. We had the first anti-war protest just a few weeks ago. We've allowed the discussion of...
That's not true. Read the newspaper.
You're talking to the wrong crowd here.
Well, all right, well, I'd like to hear your responses to this. In terms of the torture issue, we've allowed the government to set the agenda a little bit. People should be out in the streets in many ways saying that what kind of civilization is this that even allows this type of discussion? So let me hear a little bit from you. I'd like you to get a little angry and a little bit annoyed, please.
Can I ask my question real quick?
Sure, please.
Here? Hello. Okay, my question / comment is, your topic of this evening, looking in the little booklet here, hidden truths that challenge the past and changed the world. In listening to your wonderful expertise here tonight, what hidden truths or anything has changed this world? It all seems pretty repetitive, what you're talking about.
That's a good question. Let me start off by saying Morley Safer has in the book an article, or at least a report, a television report on the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and he's broken a lot of other stories. Mark Danner has broken a lot of stories, including the Downing Street memo, the massacre at El Mozote. Philip has broken a number of stories on Rwanda. And Philip, I still would like you to have a word about the UN, about the Dallaire facts, but I'd like the panel to say, what have you done that you think has changed history in any way? What stories have you broken that have had an effect? And if they have not had any effect, why haven't they?
Well, I suppose we wouldn't regard it as a very positive effect of the coverage of Vietnam and my coverage of Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin coverage is that never again will we have the kind of access that we had covering the war in Vietnam. So it's not a very positive, or from the military's point of view, it's a very positive aspect. They now have embedding, and you swear and sign and walk the walk with them. And in Vietnam, you just could hitch a ride in a helicopter, go anywhere, virtually anywhere, and see anyone you wanted. Just knock on the door and walk in. All that's over. And in fact, when that next generation of young press officers, or PIOs as they call, went to school at the War College and learned how to keep the press out. And they ran Vietnam stories and from television and the New York Times and everybody else about how not to allow a war to be covered. So that's a negative. I think a positive effect of, speaking personally from my own coverage of the war and Gulf of Tonkin and everything else, I think at the very least it made the public more wary. And even in the rush to war in Iraq, I think there was a sense of there's something smelly about this fish. And I think that Vietnam did have that kind of effect. I think that it also had a powerful effect in the best of the military about a certain degree of openness and a certain degree of conduct. I know in terms of, I know a little bit about West Point. I've done some stuff up there. I think it's produced a new kind of officer, one that for the most part we can really be proud of, by the way.
Philip, you want to
Yeah, I've
continue?
never really imagined that I would change the world or thought that I have. I did have an experience similar to yours where, I mean, the story that's in this book that I wrote about, it was about a fax that had been sent to UN headquarters by the UN peacekeeping commander in the field in Rwanda in 3 months before the genocide. Basically, he'd had a source from the military intelligence apparatus within Rwanda who had told him more or less the entire blueprint for the thing and said this was going on, and it had been pretty systematically ignored by the UN hierarchy and kind of buried, and he was told not to take action except in the most kind of ridiculous UN fashion. And when I wrote this story, I was told by somebody, you know, this story is having a really positive effect at the UN. I mean, you can be sure that from now on, anybody who gets hold of a document like that is going to make sure that they pass it right along so that they don't get stuck holding the ball. And I said, oh, so it's basically what you're saying is that butt covering will now be more effective. And that was sort of it. In other words, yeah, people learn the lesson of like, it's not don't do it, it's don't get caught. And I felt very much that, you know, even although sort of the premise of the evening is that America has, you know, is in danger from the secrecy of its own administrations and so forth, what struck me, as Morley Safer put it, the fragility of secrets in this country, whereas at a place like the UN, which many people look to as somehow checking the worst instincts of major powers, there's no accountability whatever. There, when you're the head of peacekeeping during Srebrenica and Rwanda, you become Secretary General. And when you become Secretary General, nobody ever brings it up again. And nobody ever, and when it is brought up, it's considered impolite. And when you say that you didn't know about it, people actually pretend they believe you. And there is no Patrick Fitzgerald. The major powers find it a massive convenience to have a UN that is essentially a sinkhole for accountability. It is a place where you go where you know that you won't be challenged, where everybody else is in it with you, and where you can hide things. And this was really quite shocking to watch the kind of a true bureaucracy, a place where nobody will ever face election. Nobody is accountable except from other heads of state, where they rise through a bureaucracy. There is no accountability to a public. They constantly quote the phrase of the preamble of the UN Charter, we the peoples of the world, but they are accountable to nobody, and they take it very lightly. When people are massacred after they've ignored warnings of a massacre, they simply say, oh, well, you know, we did what we could, or we were somewhere else that day, or so, and they figure it will go away because there's just too little interest. And so it was kind of shocking to find yourself in a position where you get these documents and they have no teeth at all, they have no consequence, and they're not really, it's a sort of public relations nuisance for a little bit.
Mark, you want to follow up?
Yeah, those were two terrific answers, I think, and I'm fascinated by Morley's response that you know, the beginning of it, that one of the consequences was to change how the military let reporters cover the war, because I've certainly experienced that myself, and there will be no war covered like Vietnam was. That's it. End of story. I guess the question that the lady asked, to me, is a difficult one, identifying a story that changed the world. I don't, as Philip just said, I don't try to do that. I try to tell what happened, which itself is very often, in a lot of situations, a very ambitious goal. And you hope, as a consequence of that, getting that information out, that that will be to the good, and that all of these other people trying to tell what happened will, in the end, make things better, essentially. I mean, I've covered too many stories where, you know, it isn't the information, it's the politics in the end. I mean, El Mozote was like that. You know, El Mozote was revealed on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times within 6 weeks of it happening. This is a massacre in El Salvador that killed 1,000 people in 1981. And it was out there, it was revealed. It was then denied by the government and went to sleep for another decade or so. And, you know, Abu Ghraib, very similar. I mean, it came out, it's now essentially gone to sleep, but there is a steady grinding beneath the surface, which comes to the surface now and again with McCain's bill, for example, and other things that you hope will gradually put an end to what's being done.
Mark, excuse me, let me interrupt you. I want to try to get these two other questions in, or a few other questions. Yes, please.
You got to rise because many of the people in the audience have gone on anti-war things even before the war began, and the press just hasn't covered it adequately. This very evening, at this very time, there are vigils all across the United States to mark the 2000th soldier. Let's see how it's covered tomorrow.
Good. Question over here.
Mr. Friedman, I don't hear any, in your agenda of secrets, anything about Diebold and Virtel, because when I hear speakers of this caliber, I immediately say, what am I going to do about it as a private citizen of the United States? And what I'm going to do about it, I'm going to vote. But if my vote is subverted, if Virtel and Diebold are going to count all the votes, and if they're even going to count the slips of paper, and they have the monopoly on it, who is going to make sure that my vote does count?
You bring up an interesting point, which is corporate secrecy. Corporations are really not covered by the press in terms of what is really going on. Look at Halliburton.
We are the press.
That's true. That's true. That's a very good point. Anybody want to comment on the question of Diebold?
Well, you know, my sense is that in 2000, the real kind of shock and dismay amongst Democrats or people who hadn't voted for Bush was, you know, he didn't win the election fair and square and he became president. And I think the real shock in 2004 was that he won the election fair and square and he became president. I think there was a general sense that, you know, this was even more unimaginable, that he had actually, after these 4 years and after so forth, that there just wasn't a huge story there, and that you know, there may have been shenanigans, but the shenanigans were not on a scale that really defined the election to a lot of people who were watching closely. And, you know, I would expect the Cooper Union to be laughed at for saying that.
I just want to say one thing. I must go any second. For the kind of journalism that you're really talking about, I hate to say this, you really have to turn to the kind of journalism these two guys practice. You're not going to find it on television. You know you're not going to find it on television. Television, the best we can do. The best we can do at a broadcast like 60 Minutes, which I think we do very well, and the best that one can do even in an hour-long documentary on Frontline or something like that, is whet your appetite, give you a taste for the look and feel and sound of this story in this place. But you've got to then, if you're any kind of responsible news junkie, voter, whatever, you've got to sit down and read it the oldest fashioned way of all. You will not get it from broadcasting. It just doesn't exist. We don't, you know, you could take something like this. This is a 60 Minutes transcript. I don't know how many pages it is. It's back from 1960, or 1970, whatever. 71. 71. It's 20 pages of fairly large typeface. Would probably be about a column and a half, if that, of the New York Times or any newspaper. So how much can we do? This is an hour. And this is back when an hour was really an hour, not 48 minutes or something.
When an hour was an hour.
Let's take one.
I must go.
Can I interrupt you? Stay for another 4 minutes.
Can I interrupt? I think I have to not let that go unchallenged, because I think the one thing obviously about 60 Minutes especially, is that is a program that has an enormous audience that can actually have, the lady in the front row asked about changing history. There is an audience large enough over a period of decades that have stayed with that program, watched it, so that it can have the kind of impact we're talking about when it does an important story. It can have an enormous impact that even I think the New York Times can't, an enormous immediate impact.
We have time for about another one or two questions. Over here.
In '62, my wife and I served in the Peace Corps. She's sitting here. She happens to be, her relative is I.F. Stone. After our service...
Mazel tov.
Yes. After our service in the Peace Corps, the AID wanted us to go to Vietnam because we were experienced in living in a tropical country. We visited Vietnam in '64. It was clear to us we were on the wrong side. It was the wrong war at the wrong time. When we came back to New York, there was a major protest. You talked about why aren't there protests. They happen in plain sight. I'm not comfortable walking in protests, so I stood at the sidelines and I watched the entire march go by. Susan marched in the protest. 16 different groups marched. They were veterans against the war, doctors against the war, middle-class people against the war.
Let me just ask you to wrap it up.
Hold
We're
it.
just running out of time, please.
Okay. What did the New York Times have on the front page? Allen Ginsberg, students with North Vietnamese flags. That was how the war was portrayed until all the middle-class kids who didn't get to Canada and didn't get deferred or weren't Dick Cheney ended up dying. So in terms of protests, we don't have a representative government. One last statement. Before the war, this recent war, and there was a vote being taken, our two senators, Hillary Clinton gave an enormous, wonderful speech on why we should not vote for it, and then she voted for George W. Chuck Schumer shut off his phone, was not taking emails.
I appreciate your comments, but we're running out of time. Let me just take a quick... Thank you. Let me just take a quick question here and a quick question there, and that'll be it. Ariel?
Yes, I just wanted to say that you spoke about changing history. And of course, you can't change history if history doesn't exist. And I'm saying this simply because, I said it provocatively, because when you speak about Abu Ghraib, well, who connected the dots? Mark, you certainly connected the dots, right? You've seen it before. It's happened before. The United States has been exporting torture for a long time. What I'm trying to say is that because history systematically is forgotten in the United States, because there's such an incredible amnesia in relation to the past, it's as if it's impossible to connect all the dots to what happened before. And that is something which is very, very serious and it's not only the press, it has to do with the public, and it has to do with the government, it has to do with the educational system. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that's the solution to it, but I think it's very clear that when certain things do happen in the press, the American public doesn't understand that it has happened before because history doesn't exist.
I just want to say
Okay. Let me just say, excuse me, Morley Safer has an appointment uptown. He has to leave. Thank you very much. Philip or Mark, do you want to respond to that question?
If there's short memories and amnesia, they're not unique to America. If there's abuse of power, it's not unique to America. If there's bad press coverage, it's not unique to America. And if you want to see worse, go almost anywhere else on earth. And that is not a defense of all that's wrong, but it's a reminder that to constantly use America as a sort of strengthening adjective to make these things sound unique and condemnatory is just misleading, and it's bogus, and it disgusts me after a while, because I've covered other countries and I've gone to Europe, and there is no investigative journalism in Europe. There is no journalism in Europe about French abuses in Rwanda or Africa, or the misuse of power by French corporations in French newspapers. There's look, the Downing Street memo may have been a bit of a story in England. It isn't out of the English papers, even though the English papers are far ahead of most of the other European press, that you'll find these things. It's not as if people in other parts of the world lack amnesia or remember remember their pasts or are all sitting around scratching their heads and being worried about abuse of power by their governments. And many people just, so to pretend that these are somehow bizarre American aberrations and distinctly American characteristics and perverse ones at that, seems to me to be a misleading and false argument. And if you subtract it, you get down to an interesting discussion.
Mark?
Well, I actually want to agree with some of what the gentleman said. I think it's true that the U.S. Memory of historical events is not very strong here, and there is not a strong interest in foreign affairs in this country, and I think that is distinctive. It isn't to say all other countries are different. It is to say, well, you know, I think there's more interest in foreign affairs among European newspaper readers, for obvious reasons, by the way. So I think that distinction that you made, there's some truth to it. But I also think that, you know, it goes deeper than the press. The press isn't a good way to convey history in general. Newspapers, every time before the war, George Bush got up and said, you know, Saddam Hussein twice attacked his neighbors. I thought that the newspapers should say, well, in one of those times, the Iran war, we supported him. We supported him. And it should have been impossible for the leader of the country to make an argument that was so obviously misleading. But indeed, he could make it without fear of contradiction. But as I say, newspapers and television are not the best conveyance of history. I'm always telling people in gatherings like this, at the end of the day, if you want to understand Abu Ghraib, if you want to understand some of the things that have happened in this war, you also have to read some books. You know, you have to go beyond the press, because the press does, for all of its faults, does only what it does. And covering the history of something like Iraq is not generally what the press does.
We're going to have to limit, we have 2 questions left. We're going to have to limit them to about a minute apiece, please.
After the last presidential election, they asked Tom Brokaw, well, what do the Democrats have to do now? And he said very frankly, but a lot of people didn't pick up on it, he said, fix the voting machines. You know, the fact is that we have the thing called the Connors Report out there, and no one is really following out the fact that Ohio was falsified, as well as all the electronic voting fraud that have gone down. We have essentially lost our democracy until we fix these machines. There's even a rumor going around that John Kerry, they threatened to kill his wife if he contested the vote in Ohio. Well, it's up for the press, really. You know, we can't do much more except, you know.
Thank you very much. Let me just take this last question over here, please.
I found this panelist to be extremely stimulating, and I thank you for being here. I have no affiliation with the university. However, I would like to go back 4 years, about 4 years ago this time. We were in a position where the local newspapers had on the front pages, wanted, dead or alive, Osama bin Laden. Yet I have not heard that name mentioned tonight. I have not heard that name mentioned in the press and the media since perhaps 4 years ago, and that was supposedly our #1 enemy that we were going after. So what's happening here? Is there something that's newsworthy that you can share with us regarding
thank you
Osama?
very much. Quick response.
Well, I have to defend myself and say I did a piece on September 11th for the New York Times Magazine that had Osama bin Laden's very prominent picture on the cover, and I wrote about him a fair amount. But I think it is true that the less the administration mentions the name Osama bin Laden, the less the press will write about it. Having said that, I would really quarrel with the notion that he's not in the press at all, that you don't read anything about him. And to the gentleman who talked about the voting machines, I agree with you. Having covered Florida and the recount in Florida in 2000, I agree with you that it's absolutely critical that more attention be paid to this. But I also think it's wrong simply to say that there's cheating going on everywhere, and that, you know, there are debates in individual states, including California, where I live half the time, where they've rejected Diebold, where you've had a negotiation about it. So it's a rather complicated story, and I certainly agree with you that there should be more attention paid to it.
Philip?
Oh, I think obviously one should pay attention to these things, but I also think as far as Osama bin Laden goes, the difficulty in covering a story where it's not developing is tricky. The administration hasn't found him, and this is one where it'd be tough for the press to find him, too. He's not, and that wasn't true, for instance, before the war in Afghanistan. People did get in and get interviews with him in hiding, but nobody really seems to know where he is, and so there is a kind of there's a kind of story which is the non-story, and this is also a story that happens a lot with good stories. It's a story that's not developing, and all you can do is remind people that wait, they've lost track of the ball, and gee, Iraq doesn't have to do with Osama bin Laden, and gee, he wasn't part of 9/11, and gee, they haven't caught him. But other than they haven't caught him, there are no developments. And so the Daily News has a hard time reporting a story without developments. You can't say it's day 385 of no developments in the Osama bin Laden hunt. I mean, you could, but it's not going to really play that way. And this is, by the way, something I often point out, which is one of the problems when people say, well, if only they did more to stop human rights violations or genocide or this or that, and you say, well, wait a minute, how do you know? It's impossible to report on a crime that's averted. Which is one of the reasons that it's also a disincentive for politicians to do much about things that they can't get credit for being able to prove that they stopped something from happening that never happened. So things that don't happen are really tough for the press, and I think that politicians are canny know that. So they're not going to keep talking about we're going to go get Osama bin Laden when they're not getting him, and nobody's going to bring it up because they can't show you the development. That's where something like that stagnates. So then you have anniversaries, and you have, which is what Mark said. You have September 11th, and there he is on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, and there's a piece about what went wrong at Tora Bora and how he got away. But that's sort of the last real development, and that's where these things get stuck as kind of difficult.
As a follow-up,
but I think as far as the public goes, it's very much to the good. And as soon as you start throwing reporters in front of courts and compelling them to reveal sources, you're going to dry up the kind of information the public can get about what the government is doing. Having said that, there are probably a few exceptions. One would be if a crime is committed, and that is somewhat related to the case we're talking about. Should a reporter be able to have privilege if, in fact, she or he is covering up the commission of a crime or knows about the commission of the crime? I think those cases become much more complicated. I agree that there should be a federal shield law of some kind. Most state shield laws have exceptions for the commission of a crime, and it's a matter of debate whether they would have protected Judith Miller in this case. But it's complicated, obviously, very.
Bill?
Yeah, I think there's no real discussion on the editor question. I mean, if you don't reveal your sources to your editor, or if you resist revealing your sources to your editor, you shouldn't be trusted by your editor. Pretty simple. And if you don't trust your editor in reverse, if the case is in the reverse that you don't trust your editor, you shouldn't be working for him. So that's a pretty clean-cut thing, and that the profession wouldn't work otherwise, and that's simple enough. With courts, it is more complicated. It's not. I think Mark described it quite accurately in saying that the question of where a crime is committed is obviously very important. In the specific case of Judith Miller in the New York Times, what's troubling is that the Times sort of went to bat on the notion that there was a principle at stake, the principle of shielding one's sources, and that a newspaper should never be, or newspaper or its reporter should never be compelled to reveal a source. It seems to me that if you claim, and then the claim was retroactively that sort of, well, because we were debating principle and standing on principle, the details of the case were essentially not really worthy of attention, or at least that was the judgment at the time. That seems to me to be where the flaw in judgment took place. How do you know the principle applies if you don't actually take the time to investigate, which is what reporters and editors are supposed to do, and find out if this is a good instance? What if all the different kinds of things that people have speculated about as scenarios, and I don't want to suggest that any of them are true, but what if there's a crime being covered up? What if the reporter was a...
The Right War is published by Cambridge University Press. For more information, visit cambridge.org.
Filmmaker John Friedman is the editor of The Secret Histories, a collection of stories about times when corporate America and federal agencies misled the general public. Among the contributors are Edward R. Murrow and Bob Woodward. This talk is just over an hour and a half.
Official secrets, official histories. We're going to get a look at some of the people who have gotten behind the scenes on these this evening. The book is entitled The Secret Histories, and it's an anthology of documents that have revealed what's really gone on. Our speakers this evening are Morley Safer, who probably needs less introduction than almost anybody. He's been a correspondent on 60 Minutes since 1970. He's received a Lifetime Achievement Emmy, a Polk Award, and practically everything in broadcast journalism that is worth having. He has been commemorated with. Mark Danner, who is a longtime staff writer for The New Yorker and frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. He's a professor of journalism at Berkeley, and also Henry R. Luce Professor at Bard College. And his most recent book is Torture and Truth: America, Abu Ghraib, and the War on Terror. Philip Gurevich is the editor of the Paris Review. Until recently, he was a staff writer at The New Yorker. And he is the author of We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, which is the most incredible account of the massacres in Rwanda. The editor of the book, who will introduce the evening's discussion, is John S. Friedman, a journalist and filmmaker, and the compiler of The Secret Histories. So, Mr. Friedman.
David, thank you very much. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd
say a blanket, no, we should never reveal secrets to authorities, to courts, because each of us could come up with a pretty interesting scenario of why one might want to hand over secrets to the authorities.
Mark?
Well, these are obviously very big issues. I agree with what Morley said about the relationship between the reporter and the editor or the producer in television. It seems to me that when you're in the position of being a correspondent or a reporter, your editor is on the same team as you are. And generally, I think, when you're working on very sensitive stories, there usually is an editor in position to know what you're doing, and in most cases to know to some degree about sources. And I would think in a case like this, normally there would be someone at the newspaper who would be informed about what exactly the situation was, the specific situation was, with relation to the reporter and her sources and what she heard from her sources. And I gather that the editor of the Times has expressed, in effect, publicly regret that he didn't inform himself more fully when the case arose about what exactly had happened with this specific reporter and her sources. So I don't think that is a hard problem. I think if you are not in a position to let your editor know what you're doing in a fairly specific way, something is wrong with the relationship between you and your editor or you and your producer. The question about the courts, as Morley said, is much more complicated. I'd certainly like to sit here and say I think reporters should not be compelled to reveal their sources. I think in general, if they can be compelled to reveal their sources, it does exert a chilling effect on what we're able to find out, that is, what journalists are able to find out about what the government is doing. It is one of the main ways that people in government who have problems with a policy or actually see wrongdoing being done, it is one way for them to do something about that wrongdoing, to talk to a reporter, to leak to the press. Governments, not surprisingly, particularly the politicians who lead them, hate this option. They hate it.
Party to that. What if the reporter has well, we were told that the reporter was standing on principle, but when she gave her own account of why she decided in the end to, after 85 days in jail, to speak, she said, I owed it to myself. And that didn't seem to be the principle that I recall her having championed or her editors having championed. So I think it's revolting that should suddenly turn out to be the principle in this case. And very troubling. And it of course compromises and troubles a profession that, for whatever reason, seems to be a little bit lower than exterminators in public opinion. And that's a problem too, that you know, at this point, one does represent a profession at a high level, and it matters to all of us. That's why I think people get tetchy about this, and why the press covers itself sometimes to a degree that must seem nauseating to the rest of you. And as far as being compelled to testify, even without being compelled, I thought about this a certain amount in Rwanda. Imagine that you had what amounted to evidence that might be, or what might be considered evidence of interest to a war crimes tribunal that you as a reporter had uncovered. And you weren't even being compelled, you were just being asked. There were a lot of reporters, and I think this came up with Jonathan Randall and the tribunal on Yugoslavia, who would say, you know, I refuse to have anything to do with any truck to do with a court. And my feeling has always been a bit more ambivalent about that there is a place where, you know, one's privileged position as a journalist needn't interfere with one's position as a human being, and that there are times where you should say, well, I don't know. I wouldn't want to take it on a case-by-case basis. I've always felt that I wouldn't hide from a court what I would tell others. So if I'm being asked to repeat under oath what I've written in an article, and maybe not to go beyond that, I don't see where the harm in that goes. I stand by those facts. If I'm being asked to turn over a transcript of an interview that I've essentially reported every fact that I think is of interest in and that I wouldn't keep a secret and that I would anthologize, why would I withhold that from a court specifically on what's the principle? I haven't ever, luckily, been put in this position, and on the few times when I've been asked vaguely about such things in the abstract, I've always taken the sort of Bartleby the Scrivener kind of I would prefer not to. But it's a preference, it's not a principle there. And I think it gets complicated in those moments.
Particularly like to thank James Meter of Picador for setting this up, and Peter Rothberg of The Nation magazine. The first question I think that is on all our minds, before I get in the first question, I just want to add something that Mark Danner does have a new book coming out called The Secret Way to War, and both Philip and Mark and Morley have won numerous awards that are just too many to go into here. National Magazine Awards and numerous other awards. The first question that's on all our minds tonight, I think, has to do with the Fitzgerald investigation and the Judy Miller affair. And I'd like to ask each panelist what the Judy Miller imbroglio teaches us as journalists. Are there any times, for example, when reporters are justified in keeping secrets from their editors? Are there any times when reporters are justified in giving information to the courts? I think we see almost a tectonic change occurring now in our country in terms of the relationship between the press and the government. And I'd like each panelist to give his views on the subject, please. Morley?
On the question of keeping secrets from your editor, I think when you go in there with your pen and your pad, your editor is sitting on your shoulder. I mean, you and he or she are one. And I don't know an editor worth his salt who would let a reporter publish anything without knowing all the sources himself. Perhaps not having access to the sources, but at least being aware of the sources are. And the issue of the courts is another one. That's you say keeping secrets from the authorities when you say the courts. Exactly. Well, that's what this part of this fight is all about reporters having shield law, so that the courts really would be, at the very least, hampered in getting at the reporters. I'm sorry. I would hate to have